In the early years of the Cold War, as nuclear weapons transformed the meaning of command and authority, military and political leaders in both superpower blocs confronted a problem that could not be solved by technology alone, which was that the destructive speed of nuclear war threatened to outrun the capacity of centralized political decision-making, forcing states to consider how authority might be delegated downward without surrendering ultimate control. And this tension became one of the most sensitive and closely guarded aspects of Cold War governance. The problem emerged immediately after nuclear weapons entered military planning, because traditional command systems were designed around the assumption that political leaders could deliberate, communicate, and issue orders within timelines measured in days or weeks, whereas nuclear weapons compressed decision windows to minutes or hours, raising the possibility that a centralized authority might be incapacitated, isolated, or simply too slow to respond during a crisis. Early strategic assessments recognized that deterrence credibility depended not only on possession of nuclear weapons, but on the adversary's belief that those weapons could and would be used under extreme conditions, including scenarios in which national leadership might be unreachable, killed, or cut off from the forces under its command. This recognition produced an uncomfortable paradox, as maintaining political control required centralization, yet maintaining retaliatory capability required dispersion of authority, and Cold War states were forced to design systems that balanced these opposing imperatives without publicly acknowledging the risks involved. The delegation of nuclear command authority therefore emerged not as a single policy decision, but as a layered set of procedures, assumptions, and contingency plans embedded within military doctrine, communication networks, and organizational culture. In the United States, the Soviet Union, and allied nuclear states, early debates focused on whether nuclear forces could remain under strict civilian control during wartime conditions, given the likelihood that communications would be degraded and leadership continuity threatened, and these debates unfolded largely behind closed doors, shielded from public scrutiny, because they touched directly on the legitimacy of political authority in the nuclear age. Initial solutions emphasized procedural safeguards, such as pre-planned orders, authentication codes, and positive control measures, designed to ensure that even if authority were delegated in practice, it remained anchored in prior political decision-making rather than ad hoc military judgment. At the same time, military planners argued that without some form of pre-delegation, nuclear forces risked becoming inert at the very moment they were meant to deter, undermining credibility and inviting adversary exploitation. This argument gained traction as delivery systems evolved, particularly with the deployment of forces that operated at distance from national capitals, including strategic bombers on airborne alert, ballistic missile submarines at sea, and missile units dispersed across vast territories, all of which face the possibility of losing contact with political leadership during crisis or attack. Delegation in this context did not necessarily mean granting officers unrestricted authority to initiate nuclear use, but rather establishing conditional authorities that could be activated under specified circumstances, such as confirmed enemy attack combined with loss of higher command. And these conditions were defined with extreme care to minimize ambiguity while acknowledging that perfect clarity was impossible. The resulting systems were intentionally opaque, as public disclosure of delegation arrangements risked domestic backlash and adversary exploitation, and thus much of the architecture of nuclear command authority existed in classified doctrine, internal manuals, and training regimes rather than formal law. Within these frameworks, political leaders retained notional control, but military commanders were trained to understand when and how that control might be exercised indirectly through standing orders rather than direct instruction. The early Cold War period also revealed that delegation was not uniform across forces or scenarios, as different delivery systems presented different risks and timelines, leading to differentiated approaches within the same national command structure. For example, forces expected to operate under continuous communication were subject to tighter control, while those operating in environments where communication loss was likely were granted more autonomous execution authority once certain criteria were met. This differentiation reflected an underlying assumption that nuclear war would unfold unevenly, with some elements of the command system surviving longer than others, and that authority had to be distributed accordingly to preserve retaliatory capability. The delegation problem was further complicated by alliance structures, particularly in cases where nuclear forces were deployed abroad or integrated with allied military planning, raising questions about whether and how authority could be exercised across national boundaries without eroding sovereignty or control. Although formal political rhetoric emphasized centralized decision-making, internal planning increasingly acknowledged that in practice, authority might devolve to lower levels during extreme conditions, and that this devolution had to be anticipated rather than denied. Training and exercises played a critical role in embedding delegation logic within military culture, as officers were conditioned to operate within predefined authority frameworks and to recognize the boundaries of their discretion under stress, reinforcing the idea that delegation was not improvisation, but execution of prior political intent. These preparations were rarely acknowledged publicly because admitting the necessity of delegation would have highlighted the fragility of centralized control and the possibility that nuclear use could occur without real-time political oversight, a prospect deeply unsettling to democratic legitimacy and alliance cohesion alike. Nevertheless, by the late 1950s and early 1960s, delegation below political leadership had become an accepted, if deeply uncomfortable, feature of nuclear command systems across the Cold War world, embedded in layers of procedure designed to ensure continuity of deterrence, even under catastrophic conditions. This foundational period established the core logic that would shape nuclear command authority for decades, namely that political control in the nuclear age depended not on continuous direct oversight, but on the careful design of systems that translated political intent into military action, even when political leaders themselves might be absent, incapacitated, or silent. As the Cold War moved into the 1960s, the problem of delegating nuclear command authority below political leadership grew more acute as weapons systems multiplied, deployment patterns expanded, and the anticipated pace of conflict accelerated, forcing planners to confront the reality that no centralized authority could reliably manage all nuclear forces in real time under wartime conditions. This recognition drove a shift from abstract debate to concrete institutional design, as states began embedding delegation logic directly into command and control architectures, communication protocols, and force posture decisions, rather than treating it as an exceptional contingency. One of the central assumptions shaping this evolution was that nuclear war, if it occurred, would begin with disruption rather than clarity, as communications would be degraded by physical destruction, electronic interference, or simple overload, meaning that waiting for explicit political authorization could render forces unusable and deterrence ineffective. In response, military organizations developed standing orders and conditional authorities intended to bridge the gap between political intent and operational execution, allowing subordinate commanders to act within narrowly defined parameters if higher authority could not be reached. These arrangements were designed to preserve the appearance and substance of civilian control by tying any potential use of delegated authority to pre-approved scenarios, authentication mechanisms, and confirmation requirements. Yet in practice, they acknowledged that real-time political oversight could not be guaranteed. The complexity of these systems increased as delivery platforms diversified because each platform imposed different constraints on communication, timing, and survivability, requiring tailored delegation arrangements that reflected operational reality rather than constitutional ideal. Strategic bomber forces, for example, often operated under pre-planned strike options and alert procedures that assumed rapid execution if certain conditions were met, while ballistic missile submarines posed an even more challenging problem, as their survivability depended on prolonged isolation from command authorities, making some form of conditional autonomy unavoidable. Missile units on land, particularly those dispersed across large territories or placed on high readiness, also required clear guidance on how to respond if cut off from national leadership, reinforcing the need for delegation frameworks that were precise enough to prevent unauthorized action, yet flexible enough to ensure retaliation if deterrence failed. The Soviet Union approached this problem through highly centralized political doctrine combined with layered military procedures, emphasizing strict discipline and predefined response logic rather than discretionary judgment. But even within this model, planners accepted that authority might devolve to military commanders under catastrophic conditions, and internal documents reflected careful consideration of how such devolution could occur without undermining party control. Western nuclear states faced similar dilemmas, compounded in some cases by alliance commitments and overseas deployments that placed nuclear-capable forces far from national capitals, increasing the likelihood of communication loss and the need for autonomous execution under defined circumstances. Alliance structures introduced additional layers of complexity as states sought to retain national control over nuclear use while integrating forces into collective defense plans, leading to arrangements in which authority was formally centralized, but operational readiness depended on pre-delegated procedures understood by military commanders across multiple jurisdictions. These arrangements were intentionally opaque, both to avoid domestic controversy and to deny adversaries insight into exact thresholds and mechanisms, yet their existence shaped training, exercises, and organizational culture in ways that normalized the idea that delegated authority was an integral component of deterrence rather than a deviation from it. Exercises conducted during this period frequently simulated scenarios in which political leadership was unreachable, forcing commanders to practice operating within delegated authority frameworks and reinforcing the expectation that initiative would be required within strict bounds. Such exercises also revealed the psychological burden placed on commanders expected to act under extreme uncertainty, highlighting the importance of procedural clarity and institutional trust in preventing hesitation or misjudgment. The management of authentication and verification became a central concern as planners sought to ensure that any activation of delegated authority could be distinguished from error, deception, or unauthorized action, leading to increasingly elaborate systems of codes, signals, and confirmation steps that tied execution back to prior political decisions, even in the absence of live communication. These systems reflected a broader effort to reconcile the need for speed with the need for control, accepting that some risk was unavoidable, but seeking to channel it through predictable and auditable processes. The delegation of authority also intersected with internal civil-military relations, as political leaders had to trust military organizations to act faithfully on prior intent. while military leaders had to accept constraints that limited their discretion even under existential threat, creating a delicate balance that depended on institutional norms as much as formal rules. This balance was easier to maintain in systems with strong traditions of military professionalism and political oversight. But even there, it required constant reinforcement through training, doctrine, and leadership selection. By the mid-1960s, delegation below political leadership had become a structural feature of nuclear command systems rather than an emergency improvisation embedded in the design of forces and the expectations of those who operated them. Yet it remained deeply unsettling because it implied that under certain conditions, the most consequential decision a state could make might be executed without direct political involvement at the moment of action, relying instead on the prior alignment of intent, procedure, and trust. This tension did not diminish with time, but rather became an accepted aspect of deterrence logic, shaping how states evaluated risk, credibility, and control in an era where the speed and scale of destruction left no alternative. The evolution of delegation during this period demonstrated that nuclear command authority was not a fixed hierarchy, but a dynamic system designed to function under failure, distributing responsibility downward precisely because centralized control could not be assumed to survive. This realization set the stage for further refinement of delegation practices in subsequent decades, as technological change, strategic instability, and political pressure continued to test the fragile balance between authority and autonomy at the heart of nuclear deterrence. As the late 1960s and early 1970s unfolded, delegation of nuclear command authority below political leadership became increasingly formalized as states absorbed the lessons of crisis behavior and technological vulnerability, recognizing that the greatest danger was not only unauthorized use, but paralysis under uncertainty, and that command systems had to be designed to function predictably, even when central authority was degraded or silent. This period saw a shift from ad hoc contingency planning toward institutionalized delegation frameworks embedded in doctrine, force posture, and organizational practice, reflecting an acceptance that resilience in nuclear command required distributing responsibility in advance rather than improvising under stress. Technological developments played a central role in this transition, as advances in delivery systems, warning sensors, and communications simultaneously expanded capability and introduced new points of failure, making it increasingly clear that no single node of authority could be relied upon in all circumstances. Early warning systems promised rapid detection, but also introduced the risk of false alarms, which in turn placed pressure on command chains to respond quickly, intensifying debates over how much discretion should reside at lower levels if confirmation from political leadership could not be obtained in time. To address this, states refined conditional delegation mechanisms that linked authority to specific combinations of indicators, such as confirmed attack signatures, loss of communication with higher command, and adherence to predefined operational plans, thereby constraining discretion while preserving the ability to act. These mechanisms were deliberately conservative, often requiring multiple independent confirmations before authority could be exercised, reflecting a preference for restraint even at the cost of delay, yet they still represented a profound shift away from the ideal of continuous political control. Organizational culture adapted accordingly as military institutions emphasized procedural compliance, disciplined interpretation of indicators, and strict adherence to standing orders, seeking to minimize the role of individual judgment in favor of predictable execution of prior intent. Training regimes reinforce this culture by immersing commanders in simulated environments characterized by ambiguity, communication loss, and time pressure, conditioning them to operate within delegation frameworks rather than to seek improvisational solutions. These exercises also served a political function, allowing civilian leaders to reassure themselves that delegation did not equate to loss of control, but rather to the execution of control through anticipatory design. Alliance dynamics further complicated delegation during this period, as integrated planning required harmonization of authority across national boundaries without formally transferring decision rights, leading to layered arrangements in which national political approval was embedded in collective operational plans executed by military commanders under defined circumstances. Such arrangements depended heavily on trust and predictability, as ambiguity in authority relationships could undermine deterrence or provoke miscalculation, and intelligence assessments frequently focused on whether adversaries understood and believed in these delegation structures. The secrecy surrounding delegation practices remained intense, as public acknowledgement risked domestic opposition and international alarm. Yet internal discourse recognized that adversaries likely assumed some form of delegation existed and calibrated their expectations accordingly. This tacit mutual understanding contributed to strategic stability by reducing incentives to believe that decapitation strikes could reliably prevent retaliation, reinforcing deterrence even as it highlighted the fragility of centralized control. The management of personnel became increasingly important, as the credibility of delegation depended on selecting commanders whose judgment, discipline, and reliability could be trusted under extreme conditions, leading to rigorous vetting and professional norms that emphasized loyalty to institutional procedures over personal initiative. At the same time, planners acknowledged that no system could eliminate uncertainty entirely, and that delegation frameworks were ultimately risk management tools rather than guarantees, designed to reduce the probability of catastrophic failure rather than to ensure perfect control. Debates during this period reflected growing awareness that the most dangerous moments might arise not from clear attack scenarios, but from ambiguous signals combined with communication breakdown, and delegation structures were therefore designed to privilege caution, requiring sustained indicators rather than single triggers before authority could be exercised. This emphasis on caution sometimes generated criticism within military circles, where concerns were raised that excessive restraint could weaken deterrence by signaling hesitation. Yet political leaders generally favored systems that erred on the side of delay rather than speed. The resulting compromise produced command arrangements that were complex, layered, and deliberately conservative, relying on redundancy and cross-checking to balance the competing imperatives of responsiveness and control. By the early 1970s, these arrangements had become deeply embedded in nuclear command systems, shaping not only how authority was delegated, but how responsibility was conceptualized. Shifting focus from individual decision-makers to institutional processes designed to function under failure. This institutionalization marked a maturation of nuclear governance, as states moved beyond the illusion of perfect control and toward acceptance of managed risk as an unavoidable feature of deterrence. The delegation of authority below political leadership thus emerged as a calculated response to technological and strategic reality, reflecting a belief that stability depended less on preserving hierarchical purity than on ensuring that systems behaved predictably when hierarchy itself could not be maintained. This period laid the groundwork for further refinement in subsequent decades, as ongoing technological change and evolving threat perceptions continued to test the balance between political authority and military autonomy at the core of nuclear command. As the late 1970s moved into the early 1980s, delegation of nuclear command authority below political leadership increasingly became a mechanism for managing uncertainty in an environment shaped by technological density, compressed timelines, and heightened sensitivity to error, rather than a simple guarantee of retaliation. And this shift reflected a broader maturation in how states understood the risks inherent in nuclear command. Command systems were now expected to operate under conditions where information was abundant but not always reliable, requiring delegation frameworks that emphasized interpretation, corroboration, and restraint rather than rapid execution. And this expectation reshaped both doctrine and organizational behavior. Advances in warning systems and communications created the illusion of greater control, yet internal assessments repeatedly emphasized that increased data flow could overwhelm decision-makers and amplify ambiguity, placing disproportionate pressure on lower-level commanders if authority boundaries were not clearly defined. In response, delegation arrangements were refined to incorporate structured decision logic that slowed action unless specific. Sustained conditions were met, reinforcing the principle that delegated authority existed to preserve deterrence credibility without sacrificing stability. The integration of nuclear forces into broader strategic planning further reinforced this approach, as political leaders increasingly viewed nuclear use as inseparable from diplomatic signaling and alliance management, making unauthorized or premature action particularly destabilizing. Delegation below political leadership was therefore framed not as a wartime expedient, but as a peacetime governance mechanism designed to ensure that any use of nuclear force reflected prior political intent, even under degraded conditions. Intelligence assessments played a growing role in shaping delegation policy, as evaluations of adversary command systems influenced assumptions about escalation dynamics and the likelihood of restraint, encouraging reciprocal caution rather than competitive acceleration. Secrecy remained intense, but internal discourse acknowledged that mutual recognition of delegated authority contributed to deterrent stability by undermining confidence in decapitation strategies, even as it heightened concern about accidental or unauthorized use. Training and professional development continued to emphasize discipline and procedural fidelity, conditioning commanders to resist initiative outside predefined frameworks and to view delay as a legitimate and often preferable response to ambiguity. Personnel reliability programs were strengthened, reflecting recognition that the credibility of delegation depended not only on systems and procedures, but on the judgment and psychological stability of those entrusted with conditional authority. Technological investments during this period focused on improving survivability and communication resilience rather than increasing autonomy, reinforcing the idea that delegation was a fallback rather than a preferred mode of operation. Fallback communication paths, airborne relays, and hardened command centers were designed to extend political control as long as possible, delaying the point at which delegated authority might become relevant. Alliance arrangements continued to require careful calibration, as shared planning demanded confidence that delegation practices would not produce unilateral action that could entangle partners without consent, and intelligence reporting often assessed whether allied systems exhibited comparable restraint. The experience of this period underscored that delegation was inseparable from trust, as political leaders had to trust military organizations to adhere to prior intent, while military leaders had to trust that restraint would not be interpreted as weakness or invite exploitation. This mutual trust was reinforced through institutional continuity, shared doctrine, and repeated rehearsal of crisis scenarios that emphasized compliance over initiative. By the early 1980s, delegation below political leadership had become an accepted, though never comfortable, component of nuclear command systems, embedded within a philosophy that prioritized control of escalation over speed of response. This acceptance did not eliminate debate or anxiety, but it reflected a consensus that the risks of rigid centralization outweighed the risks of tightly constrained delegation in an environment where communication loss and leadership incapacitation could not be ruled out. The resulting command structures were deliberately conservative, designed to function under failure while minimizing the probability that a single individual or unit could initiate catastrophic action without multiple layers of confirmation. This phase demonstrated that the evolution of delegation was driven not by technological determinism or military preference alone, but by accumulated experience with crisis behavior, false alarms, and the psychological burden of nuclear decision-making. As Cold War tensions ebbed and flowed, these delegation frameworks provided a measure of continuity and predictability, anchoring deterrence in process rather than personality, and reinforcing the principle that authority in the nuclear age was exercised through systems designed to absorb uncertainty rather than eliminate it. This logic would shape the final phase of Cold War nuclear governance, as attention increasingly shifted from confrontation toward managing transition and reducing the risks inherent in systems built for existential conflict. As the early to mid-1980s progressed, the delegation of nuclear command authority below political leadership was increasingly evaluated through the lens of system resilience rather than operational flexibility, as both superpowers confronted the reality that command arrangements had to function credibly across prolonged periods of tension, technological strain, and political uncertainty without relying on continuous intervention from senior leaders. This evaluation emphasized the capacity of command systems to absorb shock, ambiguity, and partial failure, while maintaining predictable behavior, and delegation frameworks were therefore assessed not by how quickly they enabled action, but by how reliably they constrained it under stress. The growing complexity of nuclear force structures reinforced this emphasis, as the multiplication of delivery systems, warning sensors, and communication pathways increased the number of potential failure points, making it essential that authority boundaries be clear, conservative, and resistant to cascading error. Delegation below political leadership was thus embedded within layered control architectures designed to prevent single-point failure, ensuring that no individual commander or unit could act independently of broader system logic, even when operating under conditional authority. These architectures relied heavily on redundancy, both technical and organizational, as overlapping communication channels, parallel reporting lines, and multiple authentication requirements were intended to preserve political intent across degraded environments. The concept of negative control remained central, as planners prioritized preventing unauthorized or premature use over maximizing responsiveness, reflecting an assessment that accidental escalation posed a greater threat to stability than delayed retaliation. Intelligence analysis during this period increasingly informed delegation policy, as assessments of adversary command systems emphasized the dangers of misperception and mirror imaging, reinforcing caution in the design of authority structures. Planners recognized that assumptions about adversary behavior could influence one's own delegation thresholds, and that overly aggressive delegation might provoke reciprocal measures that increased overall risk. Alliance management continued to shape delegation practices, as integrated planning required confidence that all participants operated under compatible authority constraints, and that no single actor could trigger escalation unilaterally. This requirement led to further standardization of procedures and shared understandings, even as formal decision rights remained national, embedding delegation within collective frameworks without dissolving sovereignty. Secrecy remained pervasive, but internal transparency was emphasized to ensure that those entrusted with conditional authority understood both the rationale and the limits of their role, reducing the risk of misinterpretation under pressure. Training programs reinforce this understanding through repeated rehearsal of ambiguous scenarios, emphasizing disciplined adherence to criteria rather than initiative, and conditioning commanders to treat delay, verification, and consultation as integral components of responsible authority. Technological developments during this phase focused on enhancing survivability and integrity rather than autonomy, as hardened command centers, secure communication links, and airborne relay platforms were designed to extend centralized control as long as possible, delaying the point at which delegation might become operationally relevant. This emphasis reflected a broader strategic preference for preserving political oversight, even in extreme conditions, reinforcing the idea that delegation was a contingency rather than a substitute for leadership. The psychological dimension of delegation received increasing attention, as internal studies examined how stress, fatigue, and uncertainty could affect judgment at lower levels, leading to personnel selection and evaluation processes that prioritized emotional stability and procedural reliability over aggressiveness or creativity. By the mid-1980s, delegation below political leadership had become a deeply institutionalized feature of nuclear command systems, characterized by conservatism, redundancy, and restraint rather than speed or flexibility. This institutionalization did not eliminate risk, but it represented a deliberate effort to manage it systematically, acknowledging that perfect control was impossible while seeking to prevent the most dangerous failure modes. The evolution of delegation during this period demonstrated a shift from early Cold War improvisation toward mature governance, in which authority was exercised through carefully designed processes intended to function under uncertainty rather than through reliance on individual decision-makers. As political and strategic contexts continued to evolve, these delegation frameworks provided continuity, anchoring nuclear command in predictable behavior even as external conditions fluctuated. This phase underscored that the true challenge of delegation was not granting authority, but constraining it in ways that preserved legitimacy, stability, and restraint under the most extreme imaginable circumstances. A challenge that would become even more salient as the Cold War approached its final transition. As the late 1980s approached, delegation of nuclear command authority below political leadership increasingly became intertwined with the management of political transition and strategic uncertainty, as shifts in doctrine, leadership, and international signaling raised new questions about how legacy command systems would behave in an environment no longer defined by rigid bipolar confrontation. Planners and analysts recognize that delegation frameworks designed for worst-case rivalry now had to function amid ambiguity, reform, and uneven trust, making restraint and predictability even more critical than during periods of heightened tension. Intelligence assessments focused closely on whether established authority arrangements continued to reflect political intent as policies evolved, because misalignment between changing leadership priorities and inherited delegation procedures posed its own risks to stability. This concern reinforced efforts to review, clarify, and, where necessary, tighten conditional authorities to ensure that lower-level commanders did not act on outdated assumptions during a period of rapid change. Communication resilience remained a priority, not to enable faster execution, but to preserve political oversight for as long as possible, delaying any transition to delegated authority and reducing the likelihood that ambiguous signals would force premature action. Training and doctrine during this period emphasized caution, verification, and adherence to process, reflecting a belief that the most dangerous scenarios were those in which systems built for confrontation encountered political de-escalation without corresponding adjustment. Alliance dynamics added further complexity as partners sought reassurance that delegation practices would not outpace political consensus, leading to renewed emphasis on shared understanding and procedural compatibility, even as formal sovereignty over decision-making remained intact. Secrecy continued to surround the specifics of delegation, but internal discussion acknowledged that stability depended on ensuring that authority structures evolved in step with political reality, rather than remaining frozen in assumptions of permanent hostility. Personnel reliability and institutional memory remained central, as experienced commanders were valued for their ability to contextualize signals within both historical patterns and current political conditions, reducing the risk that routine activity would be misread as threat. By this stage, delegation below political leadership was less about preparing for imminent nuclear war than about preventing legacy systems from generating unintended escalation during a period of transformation. This shift underscored the paradox at the heart of nuclear governance, in which mechanisms designed to ensure retaliation also had to be continuously adapted to ensure restraint as strategic context changed. The late Cold War experience demonstrated that delegation frameworks were not static safeguards, but living systems requiring ongoing alignment between political intent, military procedure, and technological reality. As confrontation receded, the challenge was no longer how to ensure authority survived catastrophic attack, but how to ensure that authority structures did not outlive the conditions for which they were designed. This period illustrated that effective delegation depended as much on political adaptation as on technical design, reinforcing the lesson that nuclear command systems derive legitimacy and stability from their capacity to evolve alongside the strategic environment they are meant to manage. These adjustments set the conditions for the final assessment of Cold War delegation practices, in which the central question became whether systems built to function without leaders could also function safely as leaders sought to step back from confrontation. A question that would shape how the Cold War ultimately concluded. In the final assessment of how nuclear command authority was delegated below political leadership during the Cold War, the historical record reveals a system built not on confidence, but on contingency, reflecting a profound acknowledgement that centralized political control could not be guaranteed under the conditions nuclear war would create. From the earliest years of the atomic age to the closing phase of superpower rivalry, delegation emerged as a necessary adaptation to compressed timelines, vulnerable communications, and the possibility of leadership incapacitation, embedding authority within layered procedures designed to translate political intent into action, even in the absence of political leaders themselves. This delegation was never absolute, nor was it intended to empower individual judgment, but rather to constrain action within narrowly defined conditions that prioritized restraint, verification, and predictability over speed or initiative. Across decades, states refined these frameworks in response to technological change, crisis experience, and intelligence assessment, steadily shifting from early improvisation toward conservative, institutionalized systems that treated uncertainty as an enduring feature rather than an anomaly. The balance between positive control and negative control remained central, as planners sought to ensure both that weapons could be used if deterrence failed, and that they would not be used through error, misinterpretation, or organizational momentum. Alliance integration, personnel reliability, and organizational culture all shaped how delegation functioned in practice, reinforcing the reality that authority in the nuclear age depended as much on trust and discipline as on formal hierarchy. Secrecy surrounded these arrangements, not because they were marginal, but because they exposed the fragility of political control under existential threat, a reality that leaders preferred to manage quietly rather than confront publicly. By the late Cold War, delegation below political leadership had become less about ensuring retaliation than about preventing systems designed for catastrophe from generating catastrophe themselves during periods of transition and uncertainty. This evolution demonstrated that nuclear command authority was never a simple chain of command, but a complex system engineered to operate under failure, distributing responsibility downward precisely because centralized control could not be assumed to survive. The enduring lesson of Cold War delegation practices is that stability was preserved not through perfect control, but through imperfect systems designed to behave conservatively when control was lost. As the Cold War ended, these delegation frameworks did not disappear, but they stood as evidence that the most consequential decisions in modern history were governed not by individual leaders alone, but by institutions built to manage risk when leadership itself might be absent. The delegation of nuclear command authority below political leadership thus remains one of the most revealing aspects of Cold War governance, illustrating how states confronted the limits of power, authority, and decision-making in an era where the speed of destruction forced control to be exercised in advance rather than in the moment itself.